So, King Charles just lost his temper in a way that the people around him have almost never witnessed. And the reason it happened is not what you would expect. Because Charles's fury was not directed at William, even though William was the one who had just delivered a flat, unequivocal rejection of a demand that Camilla had placed before the family. Charles's fury was directed at the situation itself, at the impossible position he had been forced into, at the collision between the two people he could not bear to see in conflict, and the crown that made their conflict his to resolve. This was the anger of a man trapped, a man who had spent his entire reign trying to hold together a family divided by tensions he could not fully control, and who had finally reached the point where holding it together was no longer possible. Let me take you into what happened, because the sequence is everything and the meaning lives in understanding exactly how this collision unfolded. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you have to understand the three people at the center of it and the impossible geometry of their relationships. Charles is the sovereign, but he is also a husband and a father. Camilla is his wife, the woman he fought for decades to be with, the person whose place in his life cost him more publicly than almost anything else he has ever wanted. And William is his son and his heir, the future of the institution, the person who will one day hold everything that Charles currently holds. These three people are bound together by love and by duty and by the crown, and the bonds between them pull in different directions. Charles's love for Camilla pulls one way. His duty to William and to the succession pulls another. And when those pulls come into direct conflict, as they did in this moment, Charles is torn in a way that no amount of royal training could ever prepare him for. The demand that set all of this in motion came from Camilla, and it represented by the accounts available the furthest reach of her ambitions for her own place in the institution's future. Camilla had over the preceding period been working to secure a role that would extend her influence and her standing into the reign that would follow Charles. And her latest demand was the boldest expression of that effort. She was asking for a formal recognition of her position that would carry forward beyond Charles's reign, a structural acknowledgement that would preserve her standing in the monarchy even after the crown had passed to William. It was in essence a demand that the next reign accommodate her, that William's monarchy make room for a role that Camilla believed her service had earned. Before we go further, real quick, if you are into deep dives on royal stories that actually sit with the complexity instead of just picking a side, hit subscribe and join us here at Crown Watch. We are building something good. Okay, back to it. The demand placed Charles in the position he had spent his reign trying to avoid, because it forced the direct collision between Camilla's ambitions and William's authority over the future. Charles could not satisfy Camilla's demand without imposing on William a constraint that William had every right to reject. And he could not support William's rejection without disappointing the woman he loved, without telling her in effect that the institution would not accommodate the role she sought. There was no middle path. There was no compromise that could satisfy both his wife and his son. The demand by its very nature required Charles to choose, and choosing was the one thing Charles had spent his entire reign trying to avoid. William did not share his father's reluctance. When the demand reached him, William's response was immediate and unequivocal. He rejected it, not with hedging, not with an offer to consider it, not with a diplomatic deferral that would leave the question open for future negotiation. He rejected it flatly, completely, and without qualification. He made clear that the demand touched on matters that belonged to the next reign, that the next reign was his to shape, and that he would not accept a constraint on his future authority imposed to accommodate a role he did not believe the institution should preserve. His rejection was total, and its totality was itself a statement, a declaration that William would not be drawn into the endless negotiation that Camilla's demand invited, that he would not treat the matter as an open question to be worked out over time, that his answer was final. The flatness of William's rejection is a crucial detail because it reflects a strategic choice as much as an emotional one. William understood that any response short of a flat rejection would keep the question alive. If he had offered to consider the demand, he would have invited further pressure. If he had proposed a compromise, he would have conceded that some version of Camilla's role was acceptable. If he had deferred the matter, he would have left it available to resurface. Only a flat, unequivocal rejection could close the question definitively. And so, William chose flatness, chose totality, chose to reject the demand so completely that there was no room left for it to be reintroduced. It was a strategic decision executed with emotional force, and its effect was to place the matter beyond negotiation. Charles's reaction to the collision between his wife's demand and his son's rejection was the fury that has defined the story. But it is important to understand the nature of that fury because it was not a simple anger directed at one party or the other. Charles was not furious at William for rejecting the demand because Charles understood at a level he could not fully admit that William was right, that the demand did indeed impose on the reign in ways that William had every right to refuse. And Charles was not furious at Camilla for making the demand because Charles understood her desire for recognition, understood the years of service that lay behind it, understood why she believed she deserved what she was asking for. Charles's fury was directed at the impossibility of the situation, at the collision that forced him to witness a conflict between the two people he most wanted to protect, at the crown that made their conflict his responsibility to resolve. This is the tragedy at the heart of Charles's position, and it is worth sitting with because it explains so much about the man and about his reign. Charles spent decades wanting two things that the institution made difficult to have together. He wanted Camilla and he wanted the crown. He fought for both, and against enormous odds he achieved both. But achieving both meant binding them together, meant making the woman he loved a part of the institution he served. And that binding created the possibility of exactly the kind of collision that now confronted him. Because as long as Camilla was a private figure, her desires and the institution's needs could remain separate. But once she became queen consort, once she became a part of the monarchy, her desires and the institution's needs became entangled, and their entanglement created the possibility that they would one day come into direct conflict. That day had now arrived, and Charles, who had wanted both his wife and his crown, found that having both meant being torn between them. The confrontation that followed, by the accounts available, was one of the most difficult the family has faced because it was not a confrontation that could be resolved through the usual methods. It was not a matter of negotiation or compromise or the gradual working out of a mutually acceptable arrangement. It was a fundamental collision between incompatible positions, and it forced each of the three people at its center to confront the limits of what they could have. Camilla had to confront the limit of what her service could earn her. William had to confront the necessity of disappointing a member of his family in order to protect a principle. And Charles had to confront the impossibility of protecting both the woman he loved and the son who would succeed him. The way the confrontation unfolded, by the accounts that have circulated, gives a sense of just how far the usual composure of the family broke down. The matter came to a head when the three of them, Charles, Camilla, and William, found themselves addressing the demand directly rather than through the layers of staff and advisors that normally cushioned such disagreements. Camilla presented her case, laying out the reasoning behind her demand, the years of service that justified it, the recognition she believed the institution owed her. She spoke, by the accounts available, with the conviction of someone who genuinely believed in the legitimacy of what she was asking and who expected, if not agreement, that at least the serious and sympathetic consideration of her position. William did not offer that consideration. When Camilla finished, he responded not with a diplomatic acknowledgement that royal protocol usually demands, not with an expression of willingness to reflect on what she had said, but with a rejection so immediate and so complete that it left no doubt about his position. He told her, in effect, that the demand concerned the future reign, that the future reign was his and that he would not accept it. He did not soften the rejection. He did not wrap it in the language of regret or the promise of future discussion. He stated his position and made clear that it was final. And the bluntness of it, the refusal to engage in the diplomatic dance that such moments usually involve, was itself a shock to a family accustomed to conducting even its sharpest disagreements through carefully managed indirection. It was at this point, by the accounts available, that Charles's composure broke, because Charles had been watching the collision he most feared unfold in front of him, powerless to prevent it. He had watched his wife make a demand he could not grant. He had watched his son reject it in terms that left no room for the accommodation Charles might have hoped for. And he had understood in that moment that there was nothing he could do, that the collision was happening, and that he could neither stop it nor resolve it. The fury that broke from him was the fury of that powerlessness. The frustration of a man who held the highest office in the land and yet could not prevent the two people he loved most from colliding in front of him. Charles's fury, when it came, was reportedly directed less at any individual than at the circumstances that had produced the collision. He expressed frustration at the position he had been placed in, at the demand that forced a choice he did not want to make, at the rejection that made the choice unavoidable. He was, by the accounts available, a man at the end of his patience, worn down by years of managing tensions that could not be permanently resolved, confronted at last with a conflict that no amount of management could contain. His temper, so rarely displayed, broke under the weight of the impossible position he occupied, and the family witnessed a Charles they had almost never seen. A Charles pushed past the limits of composure that had defined his public life. But here is a crucial thing about Charles's fury. It did not change the outcome, because whatever Charles felt, whatever frustration or anger the situation produced in him, the fundamental reality remained. William had rejected the demand, and William had the right to reject it. The next reign was William's to shape, and no amount of Charles's fury could alter that fact. Charles could rage at the situation, could express his frustration, could lament the impossibility of his position, but he could not override William's authority over the future without undermining the very succession he was responsible for protecting. And so in the end, despite his fury, Charles was forced to accept William's rejection to allow it to stand, to acknowledge that the demand would not be met. His anger was real, but it was impotent because the reality it confronted was one that even the sovereign could not change. This is perhaps the most poignant element of the entire story. The recognition that Charles, for all his authority as king, was powerless in the face of this particular conflict, because the conflict was not one that royal authority could resolve. It was a conflict between the present reign and the future one, between Charles's era and William's. And in such conflicts, the future holds an authority that the present cannot override. Charles could rule the present, but he could not rule the future, and the demand concerned the future. William held the authority that mattered here, and Charles, despite being king, could only watch as his son exercised it. His fury was the fury of a man confronting the limits of his own power, discovering that the crown he had waited so long to wear could not protect him from the one collision he most wanted to prevent. Camilla's experience of the confrontation deserves careful attention because it reveals the depth of what she was confronting. Camilla had made her demand, believing that Charles would support her, or at least that Charles's love for her would translate into some accommodation of her wishes. And in a sense, Charles did want to support her. His fury was in part an expression of his desire to give her what she wanted and his inability to do so. But desire is not the same as capacity, and Charles's love for Camilla could not overcome the structural reality that the future belonged to William. Camilla discovered in this confrontation that the love of a king was not enough to secure her ambitions, that even the sovereign's affection could not override the authority of the succession. It was a hard lesson and a painful one, and it left Camilla confronting the limits of what her position and even her husband's love could achieve. Catherine's role in the confrontation was, as it so often is, present but restrained. Cause Catherine understood the principle that William was defending, and she supported his defense of it. But she also understood the human cost of the collision, the pain it was causing Charles, the difficulty it was creating for the family. Those close to the couple suggest that Catherine counseled-led William to remain firm on the substance while showing what compassion he could on the matter, to reject the demand definitively while acknowledging where possible the years of service that lay behind it. Catherine's instinct, as always, was to preserve what could be preserved of the family's cohesion even in the midst of a conflict that could not be avoided. She understood that William had to reject the demand, but she also understood that how he rejected it would shape the family's future relationships. And she encouraged him to reject it in a way that left room, however small, for eventual reconciliation. The aftermath of the confrontation in the private space between Charles and Camilla is something that can only be imagined because the palace's containment discipline ensures that such moments rarely become visible. But the strain must have been considerable because Charles had in the end been unable to give Camilla what she wanted. His fury, however genuine, had not translated into support for her demand. When the anger subsided, when the confrontation ended, the reality that remained was that Camilla's demand had been rejected and that Charles had been unable to prevent it. And Camilla, who had made the demand, believing that her husband's love and his position would secure it, was left to absorb the fact that neither had been enough. There is a particular kind of pain in this for both of them. For Camilla, the pain of discovering that even the sovereign's affection could not override the authority of the succession, that her place in the institution, however secure in the present, could not be extended into a future that belonged to someone else. For Charles, the pain of having been unable to protect the woman he loved, from disappointment, of having watched her ambitions collide with his son's authority, of having been forced to accept an outcome that hurt her. Their marriage has endured many strains, but this particular strain, the strain of Charles's powerlessness to give Camilla what she wanted, must have cut deeply because it exposed the limit of what their partnership could achieve within the institution. The point beyond which even a king's love could not carry his wife's ambitions. And yet, by every indication, the marriage endured this strain as it has endured others. Because Charles and Camilla have always understood that their bond exists within the constraints of the institution, that the crown imposes limits on what they can be to each other, that the price of the life they fought to build together includes moments like this. 1. Moments where the institution's demands override their personal desires. They have lived within those constraints for their entire marriage, and they will continue to live within them. The confrontation was painful, but it did not break them because they have always known that the crown would sometimes require sacrifices that neither of them would choose to make. This was one of those sacrifices, and they absorbed it as they have absorbed so many others together. The deeper significance of this confrontation lies in what it reveals about the nature of the transition the monarchy is undergoing. Because the collision between Camilla's demand and William's rejection was at its core a collision between the claims of the present reign and the authority of the future one. Camilla represented the present, the arrangements and ambitions of Charles's era. William represented the future, the authority that would govern the reign to come. And Charles, caught between them, represented the transition itself, the difficult passage from one reign to the next in which the claims of the present must yield to the authority of the future. His fury, his impotence, his painful acceptance of William's rejection. All of these were expressions of the transitions, difficulty of the pain that accompanies the passage of authority from one generation to the next. It is worth understanding William's own perspective on the confrontation because from his point of view, the rejection was not an act of cruelty, but an act of necessity. William did not reject the demand because he wished to hurt Camilla or to humiliate his father. He rejected it because he believed genuinely and deeply that accepting it would compromise the integrity of the reign he would one day lead. From William's perspective, the future king must be free to shape his own reign unencumbered by arrangements imposed by the previous generation to serve interests that are not his own. To accept Camilla's demand would have been to accept the constraint on that freedom, a precedent that would have allowed the present reign to bind the future one. And William believed that establishing such a precedent even once, even in a single instance, would have weakened the principle that each reign belongs to the monarch who holds it. This is the conviction that made William's rejection so flat, so total, so unwilling to compromise. He was not merely refusing a specific demand. He was defending a principle. The principle that the future reign is the future king's to shape, and principles unlike specific demands do not admit of compromise. You cannot partially defend a principle. Either the future reign belongs entirely to the future king or it is subject to the claims of the present. William believed it belonged entirely to him, and he defended that belief with the totality that the defense of a principle requires. The flatness of his rejection was not stubbornness. It was the necessary consequence of defending something that could not be defended halfway. Princess Anne, observing the confrontation and its aftermath, understood William's reasoning and by the accounts available shared it and has spent her life within the institution, and she understands the principle that William was defending better than almost anyone. She knows that the strength of the monarchy depends on the clarity of its succession, on the principle that each reign belongs to its monarch, on the refusal to allow the arrangements of one reign to bind the next. And she recognized in William's rejection a defense of that principle, a defense that, however painful, was necessary for the institution's health, and did not celebrate the pain the confrontation caused, but she understood that the principle William was defending mattered more than the pain, and that a future king who would defend that principle, even at the cost of family harmony, was the kind of king the institution needed. Edward too understood the confrontation in these terms, though his understanding was tinged with the sadness that such conflicts always produce in him. Edward would have preferred a family in which such collisions did not occur, in which the claims of the present and the authority of the future could be reconciled through goodwill and mutual understanding. But he recognized that the family circumstances had made such reconciliation impossible, and that William's defense of the principle, however painful, was a response to conditions the family itself had created. His sadness was not a disagreement with William's action, but a lament for the necessity of it. There is a broader truth here about the limits of power, even the power of a king. Because Charles's experience in this confrontation demonstrates, that even the sovereign is subject to constraints that authority cannot overcome. The crown gives Charles enormous power over the present, but it gives him no power over the future because the future belongs to his successor. And when the present and the future come into conflict, as they did in this confrontation, the sovereign discovers that his power has limits, that there are things even a king cannot do. Charles could not force William to accept the demand. He could not override his son's authority over the future reign. He could rage. He could grieve. He could lament. But he could not change the fundamental reality that the future was not his to command. This is a truth that every sovereign must eventually confront. The truth that their power ends at the boundary of their own reign and that beyond that boundary lies a future they cannot control. There is an emotional toll to all of this that deserves acknowledgement because behind the institutional analysis are three people who genuinely love one another and who have been forced into a conflict that love could not prevent. Charles loves both Camilla and William. Camilla loves Charles and has in her own way come to accept William as part of the family she married into. William loves his father whatever the tensions between them and does not wish to cause him pain. These are not enemies. They are a family bound together by genuine affection, and the confrontation forced them into a collision that none of them wanted. The pain of that collision was real, and it fell on all three of them. Charles felt the pain of powerlessness. Camilla felt the pain of disappointment. William felt the pain of having caused pain to people he loved in defense of a principle he could not abandon. There were no villains in this confrontation, only people trapped by circumstances that made conflict unavoidable. And that perhaps is the truest and saddest thing about the whole affair. Because it would be easier to understand if there were a villain if one of the three could be identified as the cause of the conflict. The person whose selfishness or cruelty had produced the collision. But there was no such person. Camilla was not a villain for wanting recognition. Charles was not a villain for wanting to protect his wife. William was not a villain for defending the principle of succession. Each of them acted according to their own understanding of what was right and necessary. And their understandings collided, and the collision produced pain that none of them intended. This is the tragedy of the situation, that good people acting in good faith can nonetheless find themselves in conflicts that hurt everyone involved. The confrontation was not a battle between good and evil. It was a collision between competing goods, between love and duty, between the claims of the present and the authority of the future. And no one emerged from it unwounded. The family will carry the memory of this confrontation forward, and it will shape their relationships in ways that will unfold over years. The tensions it exposed have not been fully resolved, only clarified. The pain it caused has not fully healed, only subsided, and the questions it raised about the nature of the transition, about the limits of Charles's power, about the authority William will one day hold, remain live questions that will continue to shape the family's future. This confrontation was not an ending. It was a moment of painful clarity in an ongoing story. A story that will continue to unfold as the transition to William's reign proceeds. The consequences of the confrontation extended beyond the immediate resolution of the demand because the confrontation established definitively that William would not accept constraints on his future authority imposed to accommodate the ambitions of the present reign. It established that the next reign would be William's to shape free of the arrangements that Charles's era might seek to impose upon it. And it established that even Charles's fury, even the sovereign's displeasure, could not alter this reality. These were significant establishments because they clarified the terms of the transition in ways that had previously been left ambiguous. The confrontation, painful as it was, brought a kind of clarity to the succession, a recognition that the future belonged to William and that the present could not bind it. So, here is what I want you to sit with. Was William right to reject the demand so flatly? Or did the totality of his rejection add unnecessary pain to an already painful situation? Was Camilla's demand a legitimate claim on recognition she had earned, or an overreach that William was right to refuse? And does Charles's fury, his impotent rage at a situation he could not control, reveal the tragic limits of even a king's power? Or does it reveal a sovereign who had failed through years of avoidance to prevent a collision that better management might have averted? There is no clean answer, and anyone who gives you one quickly has not sat with the full weight of what happened between these three people. What we know is this. A king who had spent his reign avoiding difficult choices was finally forced to confront one. His son rejected a demand that his wife had made flatly and without qualification. And Charles, caught between the two people he most wanted to protect, discovered that his crown could not protect him from the collision, that his fury could not change the outcome, and that the future which belonged to his son was not his to command. The family, for better or worse, will live with the clarity that this painful confrontation produced. And the transition to William's reign, however difficult its passage, has been made a little clearer by the collision that forced its terms into the open. The next chapter of this family is still being written, and when it moves, we will be here to talk about it. If this video made you see any part of this story differently, drop your position in the comments. I read every one of them, and on a question this complicated, I genuinely want to know where you land. Subscribe if you are not already with us because the next chapter is coming and it is going to be one worth watching.